Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University. Now, this is a show called Insight, and we usually discuss books on politics, both domestically and nationally, sometimes historical books that provide a bit of an insight into the present, sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books. I think that's maybe the book we're looking at today. It's written by a man named Keith Payne, who's a psychologist. The book is called The Broken Ladder: How Inequality Affects the Way We Think, Live, and Die. So usually in a political science type of TV show, you might be talking about inequality from a political or an economic point of view. This has got a little bit of a different twist. Now, joining me on this show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Tania Contreras. To Tania's right is Johnny Peddicord. And to Johnny's right is Marina Vela. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book, and then we'll jump into a discussion about it. The author writes, "Inequality is not the same as poverty. Inequality makes people feel poor and act poor when they're not. Inequality can mimic poverty in our minds that the United States of America, the richest and most unequal of countries, has a lot of features that better resemble a developing nation than a superpower. Income and wealth inequality are higher now than they have been in generations. Today, the richest 85 people in the world hold more wealth than the poorest 3.5 billion inhabitants of the planet combined. In America, the richest 1% take in more than 20% of all income in the richest nation that has ever existed."
So I personally thought that this book was actually really interesting, especially when you get as to the reasons why he thinks that being unequal is just as equal as being poor in the mentality of those who feel themselves as being inferior. He talks about this one research that I think it was a zoologist conducted, where basically they took a bunch of monkeys and they would assign monkeys as either monkey A or monkey B. So monkey A would come up, would press a button, and would get rewarded for it. And it would usually be just like a nut. And then monkey B would come up, do the same thing, and receive a grape instead, which in the minds of the monkey was a much superior prize. Now, what was very interesting was when they would bring up monkey A again to do the same thing again, they would give them a nut again. And the researchers found out that monkey A would usually be rather unsettled by this. It would not simply just accept the nut over the grape. And so what this indicates is that we have this natural instinct to crave equality. And so when that equality isn't there, we see that as an injustice, and that can manifest itself in many different ways. And the first way in which the author sees that happening within himself was when he was a young child, and he realized that he actually had to depend on the government for his food while he was in elementary school. And so I think it's really interesting to start off with that premise that we all want equality. And so when that equality isn't there, we get into all these other different issues that he talks about.
I love the book. I thought it was a really good take. I've read several books on income inequality and the wage gap and all those different factors in the United States. And I think that his take on the psychological aspect of it and the subjective perception of being poor and how that affects daily life and those who are perceive themselves as poor, and how that affects everything in their life, from health to outcomes to family life, everything. I thought it was very interesting, the psychological take that he had on it.
I also really like the book, and the thing here interesting for me is that if you feel poor, it's not only one person. It can move to a whole family or like places, areas. So it can move to like a bigger situation that not only one people feeling poor.
Yeah, I think inequality, when you're trying to say, the gap between the poor and the rich is getting wider, it isn't. After all, I'm thinking when I'm growing up as a kid, I remember wealthy people. My father used to tell me about going down on Sunday mornings to the Rockefeller House. So this is John D. Rockefeller. So you're going down to Rockefeller's house, and he said he would come out on his balcony and throw out shiny new pennies. this is an odd thing. Think about it, that you'd never see a rich person flaunt their wealth. And he said, and so then all these poor kids would gather in front of the house and they'd fight each other. And he says he got into a lot of fist fights trying to get his hands on these shiny new pennies. This is when he was, a kid, and so that you're flaunting wealth. But what happens, I think, is in a sense that it isn't that you don't know people can't be richer. It's that you want to feel that you can see your income go up at a reasonably good pace. You want to feel you have the ability to save money for retirement. You don't want to feel like you'll never be able to save a dime. You want to feel like you can help your children in some way, and that you can and can't. Maybe you may be entitled to a driver's license and therefore go buy yourself a jalopy, but that doesn't mean you're entitled to a Rolls Royce. Right. So inequality, and I think that's sort of the feeling that you're sort of working, but that for some reason you're not sort of making some gains for yourself. It's a relative thing. And so I think that's what he's trying to point out through this book in sort of a psychological way.
And it's something that I've actually personally always struggled with, is how you see yourself in society. Because I actually come from what I consider to be a relatively poor family in America. Single mother of 3, used to work in a factory. And so we've always depended on welfare and stuff like that. And I'm actually on a lot of scholarships here. And without it, I wouldn't be able to afford this university. So from that aspect, I've always seen myself as being poor. But then when I go see my family in Mexico and I see their situation, you start to realize that by comparison, we're actually a lot more well off. And so it really brings into perspective, how the way that we view ourselves really shapes the way that we live our lives. In fact, one of the concepts that he talks about in the book is called the live fast motto, where essentially people who don't see themselves as either having a future that's going to be too great because of where they are economically, or perhaps have given up on the possibility of living as long as they could if they were rich, will essentially adopt this live fast, die young motto, where they'll start doing things at younger ages, they'll start reproducing at younger ages, they'll start having more children because they aren't sure that their first child will make it through the world. And it's really interesting how a lot of this exists within America, because America is substantially one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and yet we see a lot of the same issues that a lot of these developing countries experience. We still see a lot of people who are struggling with poverty, despite the fact that even some of the poorest people in America still make substantially more money than some of the richest people in third world countries. So it's interesting to see that division.
I think that point's a great point. One of the things that he says that kind of resonated with me is that poverty is relative, and that our impoverished population have cell phones and televisions and air conditioning and microwaves. And the impoverished in another country, in these third world countries, couldn't imagine the amenities that the poor in our country have. And I think that what you had said about how poverty is always relative to what other people have in a place or at a time. Like he brought up Thomas Jefferson being very wealthy back in the day, but he didn't even have air conditioning. I think that's kind of a fallacy in that there wasn't air conditioning back in the day, but still, like what the way he lived, we would consider impoverished nowadays. Even though he owned Monticello and was one of the wealthiest men in the world at the time, I think the point is pretty great as to comparing yourself to other people. And he brought up the airplane study, how if there's a first class cabin, there's 4 times more likely an incident that happens, and he says that that's attributed to this class hierarchy, even though nobody on that flight is poor. I mean, it costs several $100s for a plane ticket. Not very many people who are impoverished nowadays, living on welfare and such, can afford plane tickets, yet they still have this subjective perception of themselves as lesser compared to those in first class. And I think that was kind of an interesting...
I discussed that particular part of the book with somebody that was getting on an airplane, and they laughed about it. And then they called me and said, there was a plane I was just on. It had a first class section, and sure enough, somebody got annoyed on the plane.
Sure.
Yeah, and going along with what Johnny said, also like the priorities you give now, they are so much different. Because in the past, people gave half of their income to food. And now it's almost like the 13% that they like make it to food, and they have other priorities like more material things, because they all have like TVs or cell phones or other things, because they want those material things over eating healthy. for example?
During, it's not discussed in the book, but during the 1960s, you were having a lot of race riots in America, and there was a thing called the Kerner Commission, which took a look at reasons why they believed some of this was occurring. There was a variety of different things, but one of the factors they were coming up with, which I thought of as I was reading the book, was they were feeling that people who were poor, who were rioting, were looking at TV commercials, and TV commercials were aimed at being sort of affluent or higher middle class affluent, and as a result you were seeing what you didn't have. And there were a lot of other things, racial inequality, let's say discrimination, all types of other factors, but they were trying to identify some things that mattered, and this was one of the things they were seeing, was the notion of that feeling of, look at them, looking at this is a commercial, it creates this impression that I don't have what's perceived of as normal for a lot of other people, not out of reach, but what should be normal.
Sure. One of the things that he talks about in the book is this like subliminal messaging. When he talks about the Pope and Michael Jordan experiment, where you have people looking at these letters and being flashed images of either the Pope or Michael Jordan, and then asked about their own athletic ability. And those who found that saw the pictures subliminally of the Pope felt that their athletic ability was better than it was, as opposed to the Michael Jordan, who obviously their athletic ability isn't as good as Michael Jordan's. And that kind of point out this innate and inherent subliminal and almost unconscious comparison to other people. Mm-hmm. And I think that was kind of an important task when you brought up advertising, where people see something and they do it without even realizing that they're comparing themselves to the people in the advertisements.
And advertisers do that often. I mean, every time that you see a hair ad, for example, you always see a woman with abnormously long and voluptuous hair, when in reality a lot of what they have are extensions and stuff like that. Or they have, you know, some sort of weave tugged into their hair, and it makes it seem that that is the standard. Like, this is what you have to look like in order to be accepted. And it's effective marketing, or at least it has been in the past. Because, in fact, I believe it was not Colgate, but Listerine actually created the concept of bad breath. Prior to the creation of the Listerine industry, there actually was no such thing as people having bad breath, but because of massive advertising going against people who supposedly had bad breath, they were able to sell it to people because they attacked their insecurities. They attacked their ability to see themselves as being inferior to those who didn't have bad breath. And so this really just points out how vulnerable we are when we're meant to feel insecure. And a lot of the studies that he brings up, particularly in chapter 4, revolve around this idea of feeling inferior. They did multiple studies, and I think my favorite one was in regards to welfare, where they would tell people, they would ask people questions about how much money they made, where they were from, etc. And then they would lie to them and tell half of the group that they were actually making less than what most people within their category were making, and then they would tell the second group that they were actually making more than the people who were making, despite, you know, all of this just being mumbo jumbo. They just want to study these individuals. What they found was that the people who were meant to feel superior to those who were inferior were actually less likely to be in support of welfare, because they thought that they would be less likely to need it in the future, while those who were made to feel inferior were actually more in support of social groups and stuff like that, like welfare, because they thought themselves as needing it more. So our concept of equality is actually shaped also by where we land on the spectrum.
The Lake Wobegon effect, which he mentioned, so this was a radio show Garrison Keillor was on television, but it says where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. So then throughout they're using that as a subjective way of trying to say how we evaluate ourselves, which is why he's looking at inequality from a whole different perspective.
And what the book says at some point is that when children, like, they are born and they learn like equality. So inequality is something that you learn from the experience, from the future, like maybe in some jobs or in the work area. So it's something that is like implemented to you, and you maybe see like people is getting less pay or there's a difference. But like children, and they made this experiment like where children, they were giving more candy to one and less candy to the other, and the one that get less candy was very upset because it wasn't fair. So they like learn like about equality.
Well, we're here trying to talk about a book that's saying people are subjective, and they make all these subjective evaluations, not objective evaluations, because he says most people rate themselves as more objective and less biased than the average person.
Sure.
So that as a result, I think that's probably part of the problem. We don't stop to sort of realize, wait a minute, we're doing what it is that we're sort of saying other people do. They do it, I don't do it. We go, well, no, wait a minute, they're doing it, I'm doing it. And he's trying to sort of get you to sort of grasp the concept of, oh, no, we tend to all do that, and don't look at it as only them doing it, not me.
Sure. He talks about the Dunning. Well, he didn't talk about it, but we've read about the Dunning-Kruger effect, about how people lack this metacognition and ability to self-reflect and have self-awareness. And I think that that's a huge portion of the subjective perception that people have surrounding poverty. Tania, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're okay. And I think another part of it is also that it takes a lot of thinking in order to try and even assess your subconscious. He talks about what he calls implicit bias, which is what he essentially describes as us having an implicit bias towards believing that people who have darker skin are more likely to commit violent crimes, which you hear that and you're like, what? No, I'm not racist. I don't think that at all. But then throughout his research, he proves, or doesn't prove, but he draws a conclusion that there is a correlation between how dark a person's skin is and how likely individuals are to think that they're holding a weapon as opposed to just silverware or something like that. And so what we're finding from this is that a lot of people don't really look past their conscious thoughts into their subconscious thoughts, because you're essentially looking at a ghost of a thought, but that those subconscious thoughts exist because of our society. And in order to combat those, there have to be more conscious awareness of what you're actually thinking without really thinking. It gets kind of confusing when you think about things that you can't really think, because subconsciousness is rather difficult to pinpoint. But I think a lot of us simply don't give that enough attention, and we just go around saying, well, I'm not racist, so it doesn't really matter, it doesn't affect me, and yet our actions portray something completely different.
Yeah, he talks about what you have to do is remove self-interest. And by removing self-interest, how is it that you're looking at something? And so what they did was, they were saying that they did a study on looking at, do Americans prefer an American model of how your society functions or a Swedish model? And then you went ahead and defined these as sort of, that Sweden sort of had as a tendency to maybe move you more towards opportunity and some degree of equality. Again, this isn't socialism. They're not trying to say we're going to make everybody equal. It's more the opportunities. And so what they find is that a higher percentage of both Republicans and Democrats favored the Swedish model over an American model. And so that as a result, he was trying to say, well, it's sort of how you're looking at something.
Sure.
Yeah, not also Republicans and Democrats, also like men and women and poor and rich, like almost everybody wanted like the Swedish model, like before the American one. And when you get, I think when you get like more equality, is like what people put like as a priority instead of maybe you getting the chances to be like the minority.
Mm-hmm.
I think that speaks. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I think that speaks to John Rawls' veil of ignorance. His concepts of justice and his thought experiment about the original position and what people would want if they were behind that veil of ignorance and not knowing what kind of society they would be born to. Everybody kind of has this limited but universal set of standards that they'd want, and most of the time, reasonable people want an egalitarian society. They want the best outcome for the worst off.
There's this chapter in the book where the author talks about the development of the measurement of poverty in the United States federal government in the early to mid 1960s, because you were creating these programs to help people who were poor, so you had to have some way of determining eligibility standards and whether or not you were defined of as below the poverty line or above the poverty line, and how far above the poverty line, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're doing all this. And so as a result, people now use that as the measurement of where am I in terms of poverty.
Yes, and that sort of assessment really comes into view when you get older. You don't, like we were talking about earlier, you don't really see that when you're a child and you don't have to worry about your income. But as you get older, it gets into a little bit tricky of a situation, because you might be within the borderline of that poverty line and you're not sure if you would prefer to be under that poverty line, because then you can get the assistance that you need, or if you want to be above it, because then you can feel like you don't have to depend on the government.
There was, they referred to a Gallup poll study. They asked people, what do you think rich is? And so the definition of rich they came up was you had to make more than $150,000 a year. But then when they actually even asked them individually, they were saying, what is the definition of rich? It was always 3 times whatever a individual was making. So there's sort of, yeah, I'm giving you some, what I think is an objective standard of rich and not rich, but at the same time, now you start to find out, contrasting that, there was this sort of subjectivity, whatever I'm making, multiply it times 3, that's really rich.
Sure, and he talked about how if you ask somebody making $150,000 a year what they consider rich, their assessment of rich is absolutely different than what someone in the middle of that ladder would assess as being rich. I thought that was kind of interesting. How even those making 6 figures a year are like, are like, I'd want to have more, you know?
Yeah, and that's the thing, the richest will always be more rich. So, like, they are not, like, on the top. So people will always give, like, a higher amount for people to be rich.
Then they also talked about the notion of that your income or your perception of where you think you are in the income scale is related to your life expectancy and to some extent your behavior, which I thought was interesting.
Well, this goes back to a little bit to what I was just talking about earlier, the live fast, die young motto, which is essentially like a physical toll that takes place. They actually analyzed little girls who lived in third world countries and lived in poor neighborhoods to see if they would actually hit puberty at an earlier age. And what they found was that the body actually does respond to your environment. Girls who lived in poor situations would actually hit puberty about a year or 2 before those who were a lot more rich. And people who basically feel as though they don't have long sustaining income are more likely to pursue income in ways that are rather dangerous. And that's one of the reasons that he explains why a lot of people actually go into drug dealing, despite the fact that most drug dealers make less than minimum wage. Because they see themselves as getting fast money and something that they see potential in. Even though the odds of you becoming a successful drug dealer are really low, the idea of making it fast and of living fast and dying young is just so much more prominent.
Yeah, his study on drug dealers was very good in there because, I mean, he sort of stratified it. And you're looking at the fact that you have this whole group of drug dealers working for one major drug dealer, and you're thinking, what would your chances of ever getting up there are next to virtually impossible if you're going to live.
Yeah, and retirement, I'm sure, is not very feasible in the
But the
drug dealing
perception was that I see that one person, so I can get there.
Sure, and I think that's that perception of upward mobility. I think if you see somebody that's picked themselves up by their bootstraps and made it, lived the American dream, albeit through drug dealing, that you could be there too.
And the risk that they are taking is so high because they are risking like their life to go like to jail for life just for like fast cash and no tax or something.
And it's interesting too because this isn't even simply about being rich or not being rich according to the government standards. In another study, they actually did, again, the same thing. They made some people feel like they were below the average person for their age and wage and everything else, and they made the other half group feel like they were above everybody within their same characteristics. And what they found was that people who felt like they were inferior were a lot more likely to bet more money on gambling as in a winner-take-all sort of system, whereas those who didn't feel like they really needed the money at all would simply just take the money and go home.
He also then, besides contrasting the United States with other countries, let's say our third world countries or underdeveloped countries, whatever term you want to use, he did it with states. So within the United States, you got 50 states, so he was putting states on a scale, and that certain states you felt like there was greater inequality within certain states, say Mississippi or Alabama, as opposed to, say, Hawaii. And again, this is subjectivity, but that as a result then, if you were in a state where you felt there was greater inequality, you might see things like taking greater risk, and you might see things like a lower life expectancy.
And you also see within those states that the richest population owns more percent of the land within that state, which is interesting how it just divides up not only within countries but also within this country and within the states and within the city. And what they also found was that, yeah, the people who did feel like they were inferior within those areas are more likely to commit crimes, or at least have higher reported crime rates than other areas where that isn't the case.
I thought it was interesting because on his scale he had New Hampshire, and New Hampshire is seen of as low on the income inequality scale, but here you recently had President Trump in New Hampshire pushing the opioid epidemic crisis, and here's a state where he's seeing it as very high. So I'm trying to figure out how you correlate these. Now, we only have a few minutes left, so what do you think of the book, and do you recommend it to people who are watching this show?
I thought out of all of the books that we've read so far, I think this was the easiest read. It was definitely a little bit repetitive for me, because a lot of the studies that he actually talked about I've already experienced within a lot of my classes. But for somebody who hasn't taken as many psychology classes or as many political classes, definitely would be a good start to start getting into things like implicit bias, like inequality, like poverty, and stuff like that. So I would definitely suggest it.
I recommend it too. I think that it should be recommended reading for anybody who's taking a sociology course, especially when they're looking at income distribution and wealth inequality. As far as a political science book too, I think it also holds value there, because it's not just looking at the economic causes or the economic effects of inequality and poverty. It's also looking at the psychological effects and how that ties into what I had said earlier.
Everybody knows the topic, but the way that the book explains the topic, like, is very good. It provides like a lot of examples which support like why there's that gap, economic gap, and why equality and inequality, and also a lot of graphs and experiments and research that help you to understand the reading as well.
Yeah, I enjoyed the book, and certainly what I was doing from looking at it was trying to figure out how that plays in terms of politics. And so then as a result, you see him make some gestures towards politics. It's not a real lot about how it's affecting people's political behavior and voting, but you can start to get the feeling of sort of their frustration or feeling well, and how you see yourself in terms of other people may have an impact on overall voting. And so as a result, he tries to develop sort of a broader sense, and again, why I put this in a broader trend analysis, and so a neat way of looking at this. So thank you for joining us today.